She was drunk when she killed my pregnant wife. The judge hadn't said the sentence yet, but the words were already carved into the room. Karen Whitlow, president of our HOA board, stood at the defense table in a gray suit, hands folded, eyes forward. The same posture she'd had the night she climbed into her SUV, intoxicated, turned the key, and enforced an HOA rule with her foot on the gas. Life? I sat there and remembered the smell of alcohol on her breath, as clearly as I remembered the sound of my wife's body hitting stone. Karen Whitlow had been drinking that evening, not secretly, not subtly. She was loud, flushed, confident in the way people get when they've had enough to feel powerful and not enough to feel afraid. She still wore her HOA badge clipped to her blouse. She still carried the clipboard. She still believed she was in charge. "You can't park here," she said, standing in the middle of the walking loop. "This is an emergency access lane." My wife was 7 months pregnant. She'd walked less than a block before her legs gave out. She needed to sit, just for a minute. She lowered herself onto the stone bench we'd installed together, one hand on her stomach, breathing carefully, trusting that following the rules would keep her safe. I told Karen we were moving the car. I told her my wife needed a moment. I told her there was no emergency. Karen laughed, a sharp, careless sound. She tapped the clipboard and said, "The rule didn't care." Then I said something that made her eyes narrow. "You don't have authority here. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 36 then, a civil transportation engineer. For 15 years, my job had been deciding where legal control over roads actually existed and where people just pretended it did. I knew that walking loop. I knew the classification of that pavement. I knew the HOA had no legal right to enforce traffic there. Karen was drunk. She didn't care. She turned, got back into her SUV, and revved the engine, not to move, to intimidate, to force compliance the way she always had. The car surged forward, not a bump, not an accident. A drunk HOA president enforcing a fake rule with a 2-ton vehicle. The bench scraped. My wife went down hard. Her head struck stone. Her body folded in a way no pregnant body should ever fold. Karen didn't stop right away. She stopped when the car hit resistance. I remember screaming her name. I remember pounding the pavement beside the bench. I remember the taste of dust and blood and the way her eyes never focused again. My wife and our unborn child were dead before the ambulance arrived. The HOA sent a violation notice the next morning. Parking infraction, threat of fines, same letterhead, same tone. No acknowledgement that their president had killed a pregnant woman while drunk and acting under HOA authority. That's when I understood this wasn't just about one drunk driver. This was about an HOA that had spent years pretending it was law. About a president who enforced rules personally, aggressively, recklessly. About a system that protected itself even after someone died. If you're watching this and you've ever felt powerless against an HOA, you should subscribe. Because this isn't a story about bad luck. It's about what happens when authority is worn like a costume and no one challenges it. That bench wasn't decorative. It was measured, permitted, and placed beside a road the HOA never had jurisdiction over. My wife trusted them because people trust rules when they're enforced confidently. Karen Whitlow killed my pregnant wife while drunk, enforcing a rule she had no legal right to enforce. I sat through every day of the trial. I watched her lawyers try to separate the alcohol from the authority, the car from the clipboard. They failed. And when the judge finally said life, it didn't bring peace. It brought a responsibility I wasn't done carrying yet. Where are you watching from? The violation notice was still taped to my front door when I came back from the hospital. The adhesive had melted slightly in the heat, curling the corners of the paper. Same HOA letterhead. Same blocky font. Same polite threat dressed up as procedure. I stood there longer than I needed to, keys hanging uselessly from my fingers, trying to understand how a piece of paper could survive a night that had erased 2 lives. Inside, the house smelled wrong. Too quiet, too clean. Her shoes were still by the door. One of them had dust on the toe from where she'd dragged her feet on the walk back from the bench. I didn't pick it up. I couldn't. I set the notice on the kitchen counter and watched it lie flat, as if it belonged there. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was awake. I saw it through the front window first. The way people move differently now. Heads down, steps quicker. Conversations cut short when someone noticed me standing there, Grief makes people nervous. Authority makes them quieter. Karen Whitlow wasn't at the walking loop that day. Instead, two board members I recognized walked the perimeter with clipboards of their own. They stopped at the mailbox cluster across the street, comparing notes, pointing at curb lines like archaeologists studying ruins. I went outside. The heat hit me hard, the kind that presses against your chest. The mailbox cluster sat on a concrete pad, slightly crooked, one post leaning more than the others. I remembered helping fix it 2 summers earlier when the HOA refused to hire a contractor. Karen had said volunteers built community. Now the same spot had become a gathering place for quiet panic. One neighbor fumbled with his mail and dropped a stack of envelopes. Another pretended to scroll through her phone, eyes flicking up every few seconds. When the board members passed, everyone stiffened. No one said anything. This wasn't new. It just felt different now that the cost had a body count. Karen had trained them well. Before the night, she killed my wife. HOA enforcement here had never been loud. It was relentless. Parking warnings for cars that sat 10 inches too close to the curb. Landscaping notices for plants that grew half an inch over approved height. Emergency access violations issued on roads that had never seen a fire truck. People complied because compliance was easier than fighting, easier than asking what authority actually meant, easier than standing in the sun with a clipboard pointed at your chest. I watched one of the board members take photos of a neighbor's truck. He circled it slowly, angling his phone like a crime scene investigator. The truck hadn't moved in days. The owner was at work. The violation would be waiting for him when he got home. I felt something tighten in my jaw. This was the pattern. I'd seen it for years, the way Karen blurred lines until no one remembered where they were. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need threats. She enforced rules personally, confidently, often physically present. That presence carried weight. People moved because she told them to move. People parked because she said, park. People sat and waited when she told them to wait, including my wife. I walked toward the mailbox cluster. The board members froze when they saw me coming. One of them cleared his throat. "Daniel," he said, "we're just doing routine checks." I nodded. I didn't stop walking. Routine. That word had covered a lot of sins around here. I stood close enough to see the clipboard. I recognized the form. Same checklist Karen had used. Same boxes. Same bolded language about compliance and fines. What I didn't see were citations to actual law. No municipal code, no statute. Just HOA section numbers stacked on top of each other like bricks with no foundation. That absence had bothered me long before the night at the bench. I'd noticed it the way professionals notice missing bolts. You don't always say anything at first. You just file it away. The board member shifted his weight. He didn't meet my eyes. "You shouldn't be out here," he said. "You should be resting." Resting, like grief was a sprain. "I'm just checking my mail," I said. He nodded too quickly and stepped back, as if proximity itself had become dangerous. As I reached for my box, I saw a folded notice tucked inside. Another violation, another threat. This one about landscaping near common walkways. Issued that morning, issued after the ambulance lights had faded. The paper trembled slightly in my hand. That's when it became clear to me that the HOA wasn't pausing. It wasn't reflecting. It was closing ranks. Karen was gone, but the machine she'd built was still running. I looked around at the people pretending not to watch, at the mailboxes we'd all paid for, at the road beyond them, the same pavement she'd claimed was hers to control, the same pavement my wife had trusted. They hadn't learned anything yet. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table. The house creaked as it cooled. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed. Normal sounds. A normal day. Except nothing about this was normal anymore. I laid the notices out in front of me. Front door, mailbox, landscaping, parking. Dates and times lined up with moments I could picture clearly. Karen standing in the road. Karen waving cars through. Karen leaning into windows. Karen drinking at the clubhouse bar before enforcement rounds. It wasn't just one night. It was years of pretending to be law. I pressed my palms flat against the table and leaned forward until my shoulders ached. I didn't cry. My body felt past that. Instead, something steadier took hold. Something colder. If they wanted to keep enforcing rules like nothing had happened, then I was going to start paying attention the way I always had. The way my job had trained me to. Not to punish, not to shout, to measure, to document, to find the exact place where their authority ended, because the truth was already there. It had been there the whole time. They just never expected anyone to look. I saw Thomas Reed before he saw me. He was in the maintenance corridor behind the HOA clubhouse, the narrow stretch most residents never noticed. Cinder block walls, flickering fluorescent lights, the smell of chlorine and old paint. He stood with a clipboard tucked under one arm and a ring of keys in his hand, staring at a door like he'd forgotten why he'd walked there in the first place. Thomas was the facilities and maintenance coordinator. Official title. Unofficially, he was the man who made Karen's authority look real. He put up the signs. He repainted the curbs. He replaced bollards and cones whenever she decided a road needed to look more important than it was. That morning, his shoulders were slumped, not tired, weighted. He shifted when he heard my footsteps. Too fast. His eyes flicked up, then away, then back again. He swallowed before he spoke. "Daniel," he said. His voice cracked on my name. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I didn't think you'd be here." "I didn't think I would either," I said. We stood there, the air humming between us. A pump kicked on somewhere behind the wall. Water rushed through pipes, loud enough to fill the silence without fixing it. Thomas nodded toward the clipboard, then immediately adjusted it, as if it had slipped. His fingers kept moving, tapping the edge, tightening around the keys. He looked at my hands, then at the floor. "I'm just checking on a lighting issue," he said. "By the pool." He didn't move. I watched the way his knee bounced, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I was. Thomas had been here longer than Karen, longer than most of the board members. He knew where every conduit ran, every patch job, every shortcut. He also knew exactly which rules were enforced because they were necessary, and which ones existed because Karen liked standing in the road. "You don't have to explain," I said. That seemed to make it worse. He nodded too many times. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He started to say something, stopped, and rubbed the back of his neck. Sweat had soaked through the collar of his polo even though the hallway was cool. "I'm sorry," he said finally, not loud, not dramatic, just a sentence that landed and stayed there. I didn't respond. I didn't trust my voice yet. Thomas shifted his weight, then leaned back against the wall like his legs had decided for him. His clipboard slipped, and he caught it just before it hit the floor. The sound echoed anyway. Sharp. Accusatory. "I shouldn't say anything," he said. "I really shouldn't." I looked at him then. Really looked. His eyes were rimmed red, not from crying, from not sleeping, from running the same moments over and over again with no way to change them. He smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "I'm not asking you to," I said. He let out a breath that sounded like it hurt. "I was there that night," he said. "Not at the bench, earlier, before." The pump shut off. The hallway went quiet. "I saw her," he continued. "Karen, at the clubhouse bar. She'd already had a few. She was laughing, loud, talking about enforcement, about how people were getting sloppy." His fingers tightened around the keys. They rattled softly. "I told her I'd handle the signage," he said. "I said we didn't need to be out there personally. She waved me off." He made a small motion with his hand, imitating her. Dismissive, certain. "She said if you don't show authority, people forget you have it." The words hung between us. Thomas straightened suddenly, like he'd said too much. His eyes darted toward the corridor entrance, then back to me. "I don't know anything," he said quickly. "I mean, officially, I don't." "I understand," I said. He nodded again, too fast. "I just fix things," he said. "I follow instructions. I don't make policy." But his body didn't agree with him. He couldn't stop shifting, couldn't stop watching the door. His foot scraped the floor, back and forth, wearing a faint mark into the concrete. "You put up the emergency access signs," I said. It wasn't a question. He flinched, just a little. "Yes," he said. "When she told me to." "Based on what plan?" He hesitated. His jaw worked. He stared at the wall like it might answer for him. "There wasn't one," he said. "Not a real one." I felt something settle into place in my chest. Not relief. Confirmation. "I told her we needed one," he added quickly. "I said we needed a traffic study, or at least municipal guidance. She said the HOA charter was enough." He laughed once, short and bitter, then stopped like he'd surprised himself. "I knew it wasn't," he said. I didn't think it would come to this." Neither did my wife. Thomas pushed off the wall and took a step back, putting distance between us without meaning to. He looked smaller suddenly, older. "I have a family," he said. "This job, it's how we make it work. Insurance, everything." "I know," I said. He nodded, eyes shining now, but he blinked it away hard. "I can't lose this," he said. "But I can't pretend I didn't see what I saw." The words trembled as they came out. We stood there a moment longer, the hum of the lights, the smell of chemicals, the quiet machinery of a place built to look orderly on the surface. "I'm not asking you to take a side," I said finally. "I'm asking you to remember what's real." Thomas swallowed. He looked down at the clipboard in his hands, at the forms he'd been filling out for years. He flipped one page without reading it, then flipped it back. "I'll think about it," he said. It wasn't a promise. It was something else. A crack. As I turned to leave, I felt his eyes on my back, heavy, watching. Behind me, keys clinked softly as he shifted again. Somewhere in that narrow hallway, the weight of what he knew was starting to outweigh the fear of what it might cost him. By the end of the week, the notices stopped feeling random. They arrived with a rhythm, morning deliveries, afternoon follow-ups. The same careful language, the same thinly veiled threats. All timed as if someone had decided grief came with a grace period and mine had expired. I spread them across the desk in my home office, pushing aside rolled blueprints and old engineering reports to make space. The room smelled faintly of dust and printer ink. A box fan hummed in the corner, doing nothing against the heat. Outside the window, the walking loop curved past the trees, deceptively calm. The first notice referenced parking. The second cited landscaping encroachment. The third warned of unauthorized use of common areas. Each one carried a deadline. Each one referenced HOA sections instead of actual law. Each one implied consequences without explaining how they could legally happen. They weren't grieving, they were stabilizing. I picked up the parking notice again and read it slowly, not as a widower, but as an engineer. Dates, times, location. The language was confident, almost rehearsed. It described the walking loop as an emergency access corridor. That phrase appeared 3 times, bolded once, capitalized once, underlined once. Emergency access corridor. I felt my jaw tighten. That designation wasn't casual. It wasn't cosmetic. It came with requirements, widths, load ratings, clearances, signage standards, municipal approval, none of which existed here. I'd known that before the night my wife died. I'd filed it away as one more example of Karen stretching language until it snapped back on someone else. I hadn't imagined it snapping this hard. The phone buzzed on my desk. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, an email arrived from the HOA board, not from Karen, from the vice president, acting chair in her absence. The subject line read, "Clarification of authority." I didn't open it right away. Instead, I stood across the room, stopping at the window. From here, I could see the stone bench, the one we'd planned together, the one she'd sat on trusting that the people enforcing rules around her knew what they were doing. A lawn crew moved slowly nearby, trimming edges that didn't need trimming. One of them glanced up at my house, then away again. Even maintenance felt tense now, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. I went back to the desk and opened the email. It was polite, almost friendly. It expressed sympathy for my loss. It acknowledged the tragic incident. It carefully avoided words like killed or drunk or responsibility. Then it pivoted. The board wanted to reassure residents that the HOA retained full authority over common area roadways, that enforcement actions taken by its officers were valid, that any suggestion otherwise was misinformation. They cited the charter. They cited internal rules. They cited precedent. They did not cite law. They were drawing a line. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. This wasn't about fines anymore. It wasn't even about defending Karen. It was about survival. If the HOA admitted it had no authority over that road, everything unraveled. Every ticket, every tow, every confrontation, every time Karen had stood in the street and told someone to move. They were trying to retroactively make her right. My voicemail notification blinked. I played it. The vice president's voice came through, careful and rehearsed. He talked about unity, about avoiding speculation, about respecting process. He suggested we meet to clear up misunderstandings. He used the word misunderstandings twice. I deleted the message without responding. Instead, I pulled up the county parcel maps on my computer. I hadn't planned to yet. I'd told myself I'd wait, that I'd breathe first, that I'd let the shock wear off. But they were escalating, and escalation demanded clarity. The map loaded slowly, layers flickered on and off. Property lines appeared, thin and precise. I zoomed in on our development. The walking loop traced a pale ribbon through common areas, looping around parcels like a suggestion rather than a boundary. I toggled the right layer and watched as something familiar appeared. The loop wasn't a road, not legally. It was a private pedestrian path with limited service access easements, no designation for emergency vehicle enforcement, no municipal acceptance, no recorded transfer of traffic authority. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under my weight. They were bluffing, not sloppily, not ignorantly, deliberately. Another email chimed in, this one marked urgent. It referenced the violation notice taped to my door days earlier. It warned of escalating fines and possible lien review if compliance wasn't achieved. Lien review. They were pushing pressure where they thought I was weakest. Property, stability, fear. I closed my eyes and pictured Karen standing in the road, flushed, confident, waving traffic like she'd done it 1,000 times. I pictured my wife trusting that confidence, trusting that rules meant safety. When I opened my eyes, the grief was still there, but it had been joined by something steadier. I started printing, charter excerpts, enforcement notices, maps, email headers. I didn't annotate them yet. I just laid them out in stacks, letting patterns emerge on their own. They claimed authority over something they'd never been given, and now they were trying to protect that claim by pretending it had always existed. My phone buzzed again. This time, a text from a neighbor. They're going hard on everyone today. Feels like they're trying to prove something. I typed back slowly. They are. As the printer whirred, I felt the shift fully take hold. This wasn't about arguing facts at a meeting or appealing a fine. This was about drawing a boundary so clear they couldn't step over it again. They'd escalated with paper and pressure. I would respond with precision. Outside, the lawn crew packed up and left. The loop was empty. The bench sat in the shade, unmoving. For the first time since the night everything broke, I didn't feel like I was reacting. I felt like I was preparing. By the time I pulled into the office parking lot, the sun was already high enough to bleach the color out of the asphalt. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the silence settle. This building had been my second home for years. I'd walk through its doors carrying coffee and half-finished calculations, arguing about curb radii and sight lines, laughing about how no one notices roads until something goes wrong. Today, something had gone very wrong. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of toner and burnt coffee. The familiar hum of printers and distant voices wrapped around me like muscle memory. A few heads lifted as I walked past. No one said anything. They didn't have to. News travels fast when tragedy comes with handcuffs and a headline. I went straight to my desk. The surface was cluttered with rolled drawings and sticky notes. The quiet chaos of work paused mid-thought. I cleared a space and laid out the HOA notices, the board email, and the printed parcel maps from home. I didn't rush. Rushing is how you miss things. I pulled up the county GIS system on my monitor and logged in with credentials I hadn't used in months. The interface loaded slowly, each layer stacking on the next like transparent truth. Parcel boundaries, easements, right-of-way designations. I zoomed in until the walking loop filled the screen. From above, it looked harmless, a pale curve threading through green space. No striping, no signage consistent with municipal standards, no curb cuts for emergency vehicles. Things my eye had cataloged without effort for years. I opened the Recorded Documents tab and began pulling deeds. The HOA charter referenced control over common elements. That phrase was doing a lot of work. Common elements meant landscaping, amenities, shared structures. It did not mean traffic enforcement unless that authority had been explicitly granted or transferred. I scrolled. Nothing. I checked the original development plat. The loop was labeled pedestrian path with service access. Not road, not street, not emergency corridor. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly through my nose. Karen had called it a fire lane. Fire lanes don't exist because someone says they do. They exist because a city designates them, because a fire marshal signs off, because there's a code section attached that can be enforced without killing someone. I opened a new window and pulled up state statutes. Title 28, Transportation. Definitions came first: roadway, street, private way. Each word had a legal weight, each one had conditions. The walking loop satisfied none of them. I felt the familiar click in my mind, the one that comes when theory meets fact. Not excitement, not relief, just alignment. I printed the relevant statute sections and laid them beside the HOA notices. The contrast was almost embarrassing. Their language was broad, confident, empty. The law was precise, conditional, relentless. A coworker paused at the edge of my cubicle. "Daniel," he said quietly, "you okay?" I looked up. He didn't look curious. He looked concerned. "I'm working," I said. He nodded once and moved on. I kept digging. Emergency access requires minimum widths, turning radii, surface ratings. None of those standards had ever been met on that loop. I pulled up archived inspection reports from the county. There were none, no acceptance, no oversight, which meant something else. The HOA hadn't just overreached. It had created a fiction and enforced it long enough that people stopped questioning it, including professionals who should have known better. I thought of Thomas Reed installing signs at Karen's direction, of neighbors moving their cars without asking why, of my wife sitting down because she trusted that the person telling her to move knew what she was talking about. I clenched my jaw and kept reading. Another statute confirmed what I already suspected. Private HOAs cannot enforce traffic law unless explicitly authorized. Any enforcement actions taken without authority carried liability, not protection. Liability. That word hummed louder than the printer. I opened the incident report from the night she died. I'd avoided reading it closely until now. The language was clinical. Vehicle struck pedestrian, operator impaired, enforcement activity referenced under HOA directive, under HOA directive. They'd put it in writing. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. This wasn't a gray area. This wasn't an argument. It was a boundary so clear, I wondered how Karen had crossed it so confidently for so long. I printed the report and added it to the growing stack. When I stood, my legs felt stiff, like I'd been sitting for hours. I gathered the papers and carried them to the conference room at the end of the hall. The long table was empty, the chairs pushed in neatly. I spread everything out across its surface. Maps, statutes, notices, emails. From one end to the other, a story formed. The HOA claimed authority it never had. Karen enforced that claim personally, drunk, reckless, confident that the clipboard made her untouchable. And when she killed my wife, the board didn't stop. They doubled down. I rested my hands on the table and leaned forward, the smooth surface cool beneath my palms. This was the part of my job I trusted, the part that didn't care about titles or volume or fear. Facts didn't bend. I took photos of the layout with my phone, careful to capture everything. Then I gathered the documents into a folder and slid it into my bag. As I left the building, the sun hit me hard, the heat immediate and unforgiving. The parking lot shimmered. Cars rolled by on a real road, one governed by actual law. I sat in my car again before starting the engine. They had crossed a line they didn't even know existed. Now I did, and I wasn't going to let them pretend otherwise. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I pulled into the hardware store parking lot and sat there with the engine running, the folder heavy in my bag, like it had weight beyond paper. People came and went with carts full of lumber and paint, and things meant for fixing small problems. I watched them through the windshield and waited for the feeling to pass. It didn't. So I drove. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was already dropping, the light softer, the shadows longer. The garage door rattled as it opened, the familiar sound cutting through the quiet of the house. Inside, the air was warmer than the rest of the place, holding the smell of oil, sawdust, and the half-finished projects I'd abandoned weeks ago. This was where my wife and I had worked on the bench plans, where we'd argued about dimensions and laughed about how serious I got over measurements no one else would ever see. The work table still had pencil marks along the edge, faint but visible if you knew where to look. I set my bag down and spread the documents across the table again, this time slower, more deliberate. The garage light buzzed overhead. A cicada rattled somewhere outside. Ordinary sounds in a space that suddenly felt like a decision point. The facts were clear now, too clear to ignore. The HOA had no jurisdiction over that walking loop. Karen Whitlow had enforced a rule she had no legal right to enforce. She'd done it while drunk, using her vehicle as a tool of authority. And the board, instead of stopping, had tried to cement the fiction in writing. Knowing that wasn't enough, I ran a hand over my face and felt the grit still there, the residue of days spent not sleeping properly. Grief had a way of turning time into something thick and uneven, but beneath it, something else was forming. Resolve, not loud, not reckless, exact. I pulled out my notebook and opened it to a blank page. I didn't write about my wife. I didn't write about Karen. I wrote about process. Who needed to see this? What order it needed to happen in? Where the pressure points were? I listed the HOA's claims on one side: authority over common area roadways, emergency access enforcement, internal rules superseding outside law. On the other side, I listed reality, recorded plats, state statutes, absence of municipal designation, the incident report itself. The gap between the two columns was where everything lived. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Thomas Reed. "You around?" I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Then I typed back. "At home." A few minutes passed. I heard footsteps outside, hesitant. Then the soft knock on the side door. Not the front, the garage entrance, the one people use when they don't want to be seen. I opened it and stepped back. Thomas stood there holding his clipboard against his chest like a shield. His eyes flicked past me into the garage, taking in the papers, the maps, the spread of it all. He swallowed. "I won't stay long," he said. I needed to say something." I nodded and closed the door behind him. He took a few steps in, stopping short of the table. He didn't touch anything. His fingers twitched like they wanted to. "They're panicking," he said. "The board. Ever since the county report came back, they're trying to get their story straight." "Is that what they call it?" I said. He winced. "They want me to update signage," he continued. "Repaint curbs, make it look more official." I felt my jaw tighten. "Did you?" I asked. "No," he said quickly. "I told them we needed approval, real approval. They didn't like that." He shifted his weight, eyes darting to the door, then back to me. "They keep saying the charter covers it," he said. "I know it doesn't. I've always known. It was easier not to fight." I didn't interrupt him. This wasn't the moment for pushing. "I saw the way they wrote the notices," he went on. After your wife, the language changed, more aggressive, like if they say it often enough, it becomes true." He let out a breath and looked at the floor. "I can't pretend anymore," he said. "But I can't lose my job either." I studied him for a moment, the slump of his shoulders, the way his hands shook just enough to notice. This was the balance he was standing on. Fear on one side, guilt on the other. "I'm not asking you to do anything yet," I said. "I'm asking you to be honest when the time comes." He nodded, relief and dread, crossing his face at the same time. "I can do that," he said. "I think." When he left, the garage felt quieter than before. I sat back down at the table and looked at the notebook again. I added a new line under the list. Next step, formal challenge. This wasn't something I could shout about. It wasn't something I could leak or hint at. It had to be clean, precise, on record. The kind of move that forces everyone to slow down and look at what they've been standing on. I gathered the documents into a neat stack and slid them into a fresh folder. I labeled it in block letters, jurisdiction. The word looked heavier written out. I thought of the courtroom, of Karen standing there, sober, quiet, stripped of the confidence that had carried her for years. I thought of the judge's voice, of the way life sounded when it echoed off wood and stone. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about stopping the lie before it killed someone else. I turned off the garage light and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to my own breathing, steady now. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening, cars parked, doors closed, the walking loop faded into shadow. They were still enforcing, still pretending, but not for long. By morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The law library smelled like dust, leather, and something faintly metallic, the way old buildings always do when they've been absorbing human urgency for decades. I signed in at the front desk out of habit more than necessity, nodded at the clerk, and walked past rows of tables worn smooth by elbows and time. The place was quiet in a way my house hadn't been since the night my wife died. Quiet with purpose. Quiet that invited precision. I chose a table near the windows and laid my folder down carefully. Jurisdiction. The word stared back at me through the manila cover, like it knew why I was there. This wasn't my office. These weren't my tools. But the rules mattered here. Words mattered. Definitions mattered more. I pulled the Arizona Revised Statutes first, heavy and unapologetic. The spine creaked when I opened it, pages whispering as they settled. I found Title 28 again, slower this time, reading not as a professional skimming for relevance, but as a man looking for something that would stand up in a room full of people who wanted him wrong. Roadway, street, private way, authority. Each term came with conditions, boundaries, requirements that couldn't be argued away, with confidence or clipboards. I traced a finger along the text, feeling the indentation where countless others had done the same. This was the language Karen had never bothered to learn, the language the HOA board was hoping no one would read. I pulled the development plat next, the official copy stamped and recorded years before any board member had taken an oath they didn't understand. The walking loop was there, exactly as I remembered it, labeled pedestrian path with service, access, no designation change, no later amendment. That was important. If the HOA had ever been granted traffic enforcement authority, it would have shown up here. There would have been a record, a transfer, a municipal acceptance, something. There was nothing. I felt the tightness in my chest loosen just slightly. Not relief. Confirmation again. The kind that hardens instead of soothes. I wasn't alone in the room. At the far end of the table, a woman with silver hair and wire frame glasses was stacking books with methodical care. She'd been there when I arrived. She was still there now. The way she moved told me she wasn't a student or a casual visitor. She knew the space. I hesitated, then stood and walked toward her. "Excuse me," I said. "Do you work here?" She looked up, eyes sharp behind the lenses. She took me in quickly, the folder, the posture, the strain you don't quite manage to hide. "I do," she said. "Can I help you find something?" "I need to confirm whether a homeowners association can enforce traffic law on a private pedestrian path without municipal authorization," I said. She didn't blink. "Short answer," she said. "They can't." I felt my shoulders drop a fraction. "Long answer?" I asked. She gestured to the table. "Sit." We spread the materials out together. She moved with confidence, flipping pages, pulling volumes I hadn't touched yet, cross-referencing sections without needing to look anything up. She didn't ask why I needed it. She didn't ask who it was for. She read like someone who understood stakes. "The HOA charter can grant internal governance authority," she said, tapping a paragraph with her pen. "But it cannot create powers reserved for the state or municipality. Traffic enforcement is one of those powers." "What about emergency access?" I asked. She nodded. "Common misdirection. Emergency access is a design and designation issue, not a declaration issue. Someone saying it's an emergency lane doesn't make it one." She slid another book across the table. "See here," she said. "Fire lanes require approval, sign-off, inspection. If any of that existed, it would be documented. It isn't." I swallowed. "So, if someone enforced it anyway," I said, keeping my voice even, "and someone was hurt." Her pen paused. "Then the enforcement wasn't just invalid," she said. "It was unlawful." Unlawful. The word landed differently here than it had in my office or my garage. Here, it didn't feel like an accusation. It felt like a conclusion. I thought of Karen behind the wheel, drunk, confident, certain that the road belonged to her because no one had ever told her otherwise. "Could an HOA claim implied authority?" I asked. The librarian shook her head. "Implied authority doesn't apply to regulated powers, especially not when there's harm involved. Courts are very clear on that." I nodded slowly, my mind already shifting into sequence and structure. "And if they continued enforcing after an incident?" I asked. She looked at me carefully then. Then they'd be exposing themselves to additional liability, she said, and weakening their own defense. I thanked her and gathered my materials, my hands steady now. The weight in my bag felt different when I stood, more purposeful. As I walked back through the library, past the rows of books in quiet determination, I felt something settle into place fully for the first time since the night at the bench. This wasn't just something I believed. It wasn't something I suspected. It was something I could prove. Outside, the air was warmer, louder. Cars passed on a real road, governed by real law. I stood there for a moment, letting the contrast sink in. Karen and the HOA had built their authority on repetition and fear. On the assumption that no one would stop and read, they were wrong. By the time I got back to my car, I had a plan that didn't rely on outrage or sympathy. It relied on standing exactly where the law stood and letting everyone else realize they weren't. I opened the folder one more time before starting the engine. Jurisdiction. The word felt final now, and it was time to put it on the record. The county building sat low and wide, all beige stone and glass that reflected the sun without giving anything back. I parked farther away than I needed to, the habit of someone who'd spent years walking sites before meetings, and crossed the lot with the folder tucked under my arm. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Voices echoed off hard surfaces, muted by distance and routine. This place wasn't dramatic. It didn't care about stories. It cared about records. I took a number and sat, watching it blink red on the wall. While I waited, I flipped through the folder again. Not because I needed to reread anything, because I needed to feel the order of it, the way each piece fit without forcing, the plat map where the walking loop was labeled exactly as it always had been, the statute sections that drew the line no one could cross without consequences, the HOA notices that tried to jump that line by sheer confidence. I thought about Thomas Reed standing in my garage, keys rattling in his hand, about the way he'd said they wanted to repaint curbs, make it look official, as if paint could rewrite law. My number lit up. The clerk behind the counter was younger than I expected, hair pulled back tight, glasses perched low on her nose. She smiled politely, the kind of smile that had nothing to do with what you were about to hand over. "How can I help you?" she asked. "I need to file a formal challenge to an HOA's claimed enforcement authority," I said, specifically regarding traffic control on a private pedestrian path. Her smile didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. "Do you have documentation?" I slid the folder across. She opened it and began flipping through, her movements efficient, practiced. She paused at the plat map, frowned slightly, then turned to the statutes. Her finger traced a line of text. She looked up at me. "This is about the incident last month," she said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. She nodded once and continued reading. The room around us faded into the background hum of government work being done by people who understood the weight of paper. "I'll need to log this as a jurisdictional dispute," she said. "That triggers a review." "By whom?" I asked. "County council," she said. "And transportation." Transportation. The word felt solid. She typed quickly, the keyboard clicking like a metronome. When she finished, she printed a receipt and slid it toward me. "You'll be notified if they need additional information," she said. "Otherwise, expect correspondence within a few weeks." Weeks? The timeline stretched in my mind. Long enough for the HOA to keep pushing. Long enough for them to make mistakes. As I turned to leave, she spoke again. "For what it's worth," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "This looks thorough." I nodded and walked out without responding. Gratitude felt out of place here. This wasn't about kindness. It was about accuracy. Outside, the heat hit me like a wall. I stood for a moment on the steps, breathing it in, letting my heart rate settle. The filing had been clean. On record. Unavoidable. The phone buzzed in my pocket before I reached the car. "HOA board update," the subject read. I didn't open it until I was seated, door closed, engine still off. The email was longer this time, more formal. It referenced the tragic incident again, then pivoted hard into authority. The board asserted its right to regulate common areas for safety. It warned residents against external interference and misinterpretation of governing documents. They were circling the wagons. I scrolled further, and felt a familiar tightening in my chest. They'd attached a revised policy. Emergency access enforcement procedures. I opened it and read every line. They'd changed language, softened some phrases, added others. But the core claim remained. They were trying to create legitimacy retroactively, papering over years of overreach with a document dated after my wife's death. I laughed once, short and humorless, then stopped. This was the mistake. I forwarded the email and attachment to myself and then to the case file number the clerk had given me. No commentary, no argument, just evidence. At a red light on the way home, I checked my phone again. A message from Thomas. They told me not to talk to anyone. They said county people might call. They're nervous, I typed back carefully. If they do, tell the truth. The light changed. I drove. When I got home, I didn't go inside. I walked straight to the bench. The stone was still warm from the sun. I sat where my wife had sat, my hand resting on the cool edge where her fingers had gripped that night. The loop curved away in both directions, quiet now, empty. I thought about how much effort the HOA was putting into pretending this was theirs, how many emails, policies, and notices it took to prop up a lie once it started to collapse. I took out my phone and reviewed the photos I'd taken of the conference room layout at work. The documents spread like a map of cause and effect. I added screenshots of the new HOA policy. I labeled them carefully. Dates mattered. Sequence mattered. Back inside, I set up a folder on my computer labeled Review Correspondence. Everything went in there, every notice, every email, every change in tone. I wasn't rushing anymore. The filing had changed the terrain. Now, every move they made was on record. That evening, a neighbor knocked on my door. He stood awkwardly on the porch, hands in his pockets. They sent me a warning today, he said, about my truck. Same thing they did to you. I nodded. Did they cite any law? He shook his head. I didn't think so, I said. He hesitated. What are you doing? I looked past him toward the street, where the walking loop disappeared into shadow. I'm letting them show their hand, I said. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a single sentence at the top of a new page in my notebook. They can't stop themselves, because once authority is questioned, people either prove it or expose it. And the HOA was doing the latter with every message they sent. I turned off the light and stood in the dark, listening to the house settle around me. The challenge was filed. The record was open. Now all I had to do was wait and watch. They would give me everything else I needed. Waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. That became clear within 48 hours of filing. The HOA stopped pretending everything was routine. Notices didn't slow down. They multiplied. Emails hit inboxes late at night and early in the morning. Stamped urgent, marked confidential, filled with language that tried too hard to sound calm. I watched it all from the small coffee shop on the edge of the development, the kind of place people used when they didn't want to be seen by neighbors. The window faced the parking lot, and from my table I could see cars coming and going, people lingering longer than usual before stepping out, glancing around like they were entering hostile territory. I spread my notebook open beside my cup and wrote times, dates, phrases. Not what they said, but how they said it. Authority shifts when it's threatened. It either becomes quieter or louder. Karen had always chosen louder. The board was following her pattern. An email arrived while I was mid-sip. Emergency meeting announcement. I didn't open it immediately. I waited until my hand stopped shaking. Then I read. They were calling an emergency board meeting to reaffirm enforcement authority and ensure resident safety. Attendance. Encouraged. Questions discouraged. The language was almost comical in its insistence. They wanted a show. My phone buzzed again, this time from Thomas. They're asking me to prep slides about road safety. They want photos of the loop. I stared at the screen. Prep slides. They weren't just bluffing anymore. They were manufacturing evidence, not falsifying documents exactly, but framing reality to fit their claim. Angles, selective wording, images without context. This was the overreach I'd been waiting for. I typed back, do nothing without written instruction. A few seconds passed. Okay, he replied. I closed my notebook and left the coffee shop, the bell over the door chiming softly behind me. Outside, the afternoon heat pressed down, the sky white with it. I drove slowly through the community, past familiar houses, past driveways where cars had been moved an inch at a time to avoid attention. Near the walking loop, I saw new cones, bright orange, fresh, placed just wide enough to suggest lanes that had never existed. Someone had already stenciled emergency access on the pavement in yellow paint that was still tacky. I pulled over and got out. The smell hit first, sharp, chemical, too new. They were repainting history. A man in an HOA polo stood nearby, hands on his hips, surveying the work. He didn't look up when I approached. "Who authorized this?" I asked. He stiffened. "Board directive." "When?" "Yesterday." "Do you have the permit?" He hesitated, looked at the cones, looked at the paint. "They said it wasn't necessary," he said. I nodded. "Who said?" "Karen always said." He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "The board." I stepped back and took photos, wide shots, close-ups, the cones, the fresh paint, the lack of signage consistent with code. I made sure to capture the date stamp. This was no longer subtle. This was desperation. By the time I got home, my inbox was full. Neighbors forwarding notices, screenshots of warnings. One message stood out. They're saying, if we don't comply, they'll escalate to towing immediately. I forwarded everything to the county case file address again. Still no commentary. Just facts stacking up like weight. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table and laid out what I had. The filing receipt, the HOA's revised policy, photos of retroactive enforcement, notices issued after the challenge. Each piece on its own might have looked harmless. Together, they told a story. This wasn't an HOA acting within uncertainty. This was an HOA trying to outrun a truth that was already on record. The phone rang. "Unknown number?" I answered. "Mr. Mercer," a voice said, calm, professional. "This is county transportation. We're reviewing your submission." My heart rate jumped, but my voice stayed even. "Yes." "We've received additional materials today," the voice continued. "Can you confirm these are from the HOA?" "Yes," I said. "Issued after the incident and after the filing." There was a pause. Paper rustled. "That timing is noted," the voice said. "I assumed it would be," I replied. Another pause, longer this time. "We may need further clarification," they said, "and possibly statements from individuals involved in implementation." I thought of Thomas, of his keys rattling, of the way he'd said he couldn't pretend anymore. "I understand," I said. "I'll make myself available." After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at the tabletop. The house creaked softly as it cooled. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked, then went quiet. They'd crossed into a phase they couldn't walk back from. Every cone, every email, every rushed policy update was proof they'd known all along that authority mattered, and they were afraid. I opened my notebook and wrote a final heading at the top of the next page. Implementation window. Under it, I listed what was coming. County review, HOA emergency meeting, witness pressure, public unraveling. This was the part where people usually made mistakes, where confidence slipped and fear took over, where lies became louder and easier to catch. I stood and walked to the window. The walking loop glowed faintly under the streetlights. The new paint shone brighter than everything else, a false marker screaming for attention. They thought they were fixing a problem. What they were really doing was proving mine. Tomorrow, the board would stand in front of residents and try to explain why authority suddenly needed reinforcing, why enforcement had to get harsher after a pregnant woman had been killed. They'd talk about safety. I would let the record speak, because once you force a lie to operate in daylight, it collapses under its own weight. And the HOA had dragged theirs into the sun, all on its own. By the time the meeting happened, the outcome was already moving. They just didn't know it yet. The conference room smelled like dry erase markers and stale coffee. I arrived early, the way I always did when the stakes were high. The table was long, polished to the point of reflection, and surrounded by chairs that had hosted arguments far less consequential than the one forming now. A city seal hung on the wall opposite the door, its edges worn smooth by time and neglect. This was where process stopped being theoretical. I laid my folder out carefully, aligning each stack the way I would before a presentation that couldn't afford improvisation. Maps on the left, statutes in the center, HOA correspondence on the right, dates visible, sequence undeniable. The county transportation attorney entered a few minutes later, followed by an assistant and a woman from risk management. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. They didn't need to. The weight of the file had already spoken for me. "Mr. Mercer?" the attorney said, taking a seat. "We've reviewed your submission." I nodded and waited. "The jurisdictional issue is clear," she continued. "The path in question is not a roadway under Title 28. The HOA has no authority to enforce traffic control there." I felt my shoulders loosen slightly, just enough to notice. "And the enforcement actions taken after the incident," the risk manager added, flipping through a binder, "compound the exposure, especially the retroactive policy updates." "They were trying to create standing after the fact," I said. "Yes," the attorney replied, "and in doing so, they weakened their position." She slid a document across the table toward me. "It's a formal determination," she said. "It will be entered into the record." I picked it up and read the first line. "Lack of jurisdiction. Simple, clean, final." "This will be communicated to the HOA," she said. "They'll be instructed to cease enforcement immediately." "And the criminal case?" I asked. She met my eyes evenly. "This removes any ambiguity about authority. The defendant was not acting under lawful HOA enforcement. That matters." I thought of Karen's lawyers, how they'd tried to blur the lines between her role and her recklessness, how they'd leaned on the idea that she was performing a duty. That excuse was gone now. I thanked them and gathered my things. As I stood, the attorney spoke again. "You did this the right way," she said. "Not everyone does." Outside, the air was thick and hot, but I welcomed it. The sun pressed against my skin like proof of something real. I stood on the steps for a moment, breathing it in, letting the finality settle. The phone buzzed before I reached my car. Emergency HOA meeting reminder. I opened it and read without emotion. Tonight. Of course it was. They were still trying to outrun what had already caught them. I drove home slowly, the radio off, the road familiar. When I pulled into the driveway, I didn't go inside. I grabbed the determination letter from my bag and walked straight toward the clubhouse. The parking lot was half full already. Cars lined up crooked, people stepping out in small groups, voices low, faces tense. The doors to the clubhouse stood open, light spilling out like an invitation no one wanted. Inside, the room buzzed with nervous energy. Folding chairs scraped against tile. People whispered, stopped when they saw me, then whispered again. The board sat at the front, expressions carefully neutral. The vice president cleared his throat when he noticed me and shifted in his seat. I didn't sit. I walked to the side of the room and stood against the wall, the determination letter folded in my hand like a weight I was ready to drop. The meeting began with familiar language: safety, community, unity. The vice president spoke about difficult times and the importance of trust. He avoided Karen's name entirely. Then he pivoted. "As you all know," he said, "there have been questions raised about our authority." I stepped forward. Every head turned. "I have an answer," I said. The room went still. I walked to the front and placed the letter on the table, sliding it toward him. "This is the county's determination," I said. "Effective immediately, the HOA has no authority to enforce traffic control on the walking loop or any related path." Murmurs rippled through the room. The vice president stared at the paper, his face draining of color. "They've instructed you to cease enforcement," I continued. "Any further action exposes the board to additional liability." Someone in the back let out a short, sharp laugh. Another person whispered a curse. The vice president opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "We haven't reviewed this," he said. "You will," I replied. "They're sending it directly." The room erupted. Questions flew, voices rose. Someone demanded to know why fines were still being issued. Someone else asked about the cones, the fresh paint. I stepped back and let it happen. This wasn't my meeting anymore. As the board struggled to regain control, I saw Thomas standing near the back, hands clenched at his sides. When our eyes met, he nodded once. Not fear, resolve. I left before the meeting ended. Outside, the night had cooled just enough to breathe. I walked past the walking loop, the false paint glowing under the lights, the cones casting long shadows that looked ridiculous now. The determination letter felt lighter in my pocket. Tomorrow, the enforcement would stop. The cones would come down. The signs would be questioned. And in court, The last defense Karen had clung to would evaporate. I stood by the bench for a moment, my hand resting on the cool stone. "This is for you," I said quietly. The process had worked, not because it was kind, but because it was precise, and precision, when applied at the right moment, is unstoppable. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not emotionally, physically. The kind of cold that seeps through fabric and settles in your bones, reminding you that this place was built for control, not comfort. I took my seat on the hard wooden bench and rested my hands on my knees, feeling the faint tremor there before it stilled. Karen Whitlow sat at the defense table in a navy suit that looked newly pressed. Her hair was pulled back tight, her face composed in a way that would have looked professional anywhere else. Here, it looked rehearsed. Her attorney leaned in close, whispering, and she nodded without looking at him, eyes fixed straight ahead. I didn't look away. The bailiff called the room to order. Chairs scraped. Someone coughed. The judge entered, and everyone rose in unison, a choreography I'd watched play out dozens of times over the past months. When we sat again, the weight of the moment pressed down harder than the cold. This was it. The prosecution opened by laying out what everyone already knew: blood alcohol levels, witness statements, the trajectory of the vehicle, the bench, the impact, the absence of braking. The words were clinical, precise, stripped of anything that could be mistaken for drama. Karen's attorney stood when it was his turn. He spoke calmly, confidently, the way people do when they believe authority will cushion the fall. He talked about intent, about confusion, about a woman performing her duties under pressure. He leaned on the idea that Karen had been enforcing HOA safety rules, acting in good faith, making a tragic mistake. I felt my jaw tighten. That argument had been their lifeline from the beginning. When the county determination was entered into evidence, the air in the room shifted. The prosecutor held the document up, the pages catching the light. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. According to this formal finding, he said, the homeowners association had no legal authority to enforce traffic control on the path where the incident occurred. Karen's attorney stood halfway out of his chair. "Objection. Overruled," the judge said, voice sharp. The prosecutor continued. The defendant was not acting under lawful authority. The enforcement action cited as justification for her presence in the roadway was invalid. I watched Karen then. For the first time, her composure cracked, just slightly. A tightening around the eyes, a breath taken too fast. The defense tried to recover. They argued ignorance. They argued precedent. They argued that authority had been assumed, practiced, accepted by residents. The judge leaned forward. "Assumed authority is not authority," he said. The words landed with a finality that vibrated through the room. Witnesses were called. A neighbor described seeing Karen drinking earlier that evening. A first responder described the scene: the smell of alcohol, the lack of skid marks, the position of the vehicle. Then Thomas Reed was called. He walked to the stand slowly, shoulders squared, but jaw tight. He took the oath with a voice that wavered only slightly. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He spoke the way people do when they've stopped protecting themselves. He testified about signage, about directives, about being told to install markers without permits, about raising concerns and being waved off, about knowing the path wasn't a roadway and watching it be treated like one anyway. Karen stared straight ahead while he spoke. When cross-examination came, her attorney tried to shake him, tried to suggest misunderstanding, tried to imply bitterness. Thomas didn't bite. "I followed instructions," he said, "but I knew they weren't backed by law." Silence followed that sentence, heavy, unavoidable. When I was called, I walked to the stand with my back straight and my hands steady. I answered questions the same way I'd answered them in my office for years, clearly, precisely, without speculation. I explained the classifications, the statutes, the absence of municipal designation. I explained how authority works when it's real and how it looks when it's faked. I didn't talk about my wife unless asked. When I kept my eyes on the judge and my voice even. She trusted that the person enforcing the rule knew what they were doing, I said. They didn't. Karen's attorney tried one last time to frame it as an accident, a mistake made in the course of duty. The prosecutor stood. There was no duty, he said. There was no authority. There was only a drunk driver enforcing a rule she had no right to enforce. The judge recessed briefly before delivering the sentence. When he returned, the room felt impossibly still. "Karen Whitlow," he said, "you used assumed authority to justify reckless behavior. That authority did not exist." He paused, letting the words settle. "You killed a pregnant woman while intoxicated and acting outside the law. This court will not excuse that. Life." The word echoed, not loudly, but thoroughly, filling every corner of the room. Karen's shoulders sagged. Her attorney placed a hand on her arm. She didn't react. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel relief. I felt something quieter and heavier, like a door closing in a house that would never sound the same again. As the courtroom emptied, people avoided my eyes. Some nodded, some whispered condolences that felt too late to land. I walked out alone. Outside, the sun was bright enough to make me squint. Cars moved past on the street, governed by rules no one questioned. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in. The lie had collapsed in public, under scrutiny. Under law, Karen Whitlow hadn't been punished because she was drunk, or because she was cruel, or because she was careless. She'd been punished because she pretended power where none existed and used it to kill. I turned away from the courthouse and headed for the car. There was one place left to go. I went back to the bench after the courtroom emptied, not right away. I drove for a while first, letting the roads carry me without purpose. Traffic lights changed when they were supposed to. Cars stopped where they were supposed to. Authority, real authority, did its quiet work without anyone needing to think about it. That contrast stayed with me as I parked near the walking loop and stepped out into the evening air. The false paint was gone. The cones were gone too. No emergency access lettering, no temporary fixes pretending to be permanent truth. Just pavement, grass, and the soft curve of the path the way it had always been before Karen decided to own it. The bench waited in the same place, stone, solid, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it held. I sat down slowly, feeling the cool surface through my clothes, and rested my hands where hers had been that night. The world didn't rush back in. It stayed quiet, respectful, in a way courtrooms never are. After the sentencing, the HOA folded faster than I expected. The board issued a notice the next morning, short, legal, apologetic without actually apologizing. They acknowledged the county determination. They confirmed all traffic enforcement on pedestrian paths had ceased permanently. They suspended multiple policies pending review. 2 board members resigned within a week. Karen's name disappeared from the website, then from the minutes, then from conversation. People stopped lowering their voices when I walked by. Neighbors who'd never spoken to me before nodded, stopped, shared their own stories. Parking warnings that made no sense. Confrontations that felt wrong. Times they'd moved because it was easier than asking why. Thomas Reed kept his job. He didn't celebrate it. He didn't thank me. He just started doing things differently. Permits where permits were required. Emails asking for approval instead of assuming it. When someone asked him why, he told them the truth. "We don't get to pretend anymore." That phrase spread quietly through the neighborhood. The HOA hired an outside consultant to review their authority. Real authority this time. The report came back thinner than anyone expected. Less power, fewer assumptions, clear boundaries. Property values didn't collapse. Safety didn't disappear. The world didn't end because someone said no. What did end was the idea that confidence could replace law. I sat on the bench until the light shifted and the cicadas started up, their sound filling the space like a reminder that life moves forward whether you're ready or not. I thought about the version of myself who'd stood here months earlier, begging for 2 minutes. The man who'd trusted that compliance would protect the people he loved. I don't blame him. Rules are supposed to mean safety. Authority is supposed to come with restraint. Most of us live our lives assuming those things are true because the alternative is exhausting. But sometimes, someone decides rules are a costume. Sometimes power is worn instead of earned. And when no one checks it, it grows teeth. The court didn't bring my wife back. It didn't bring our child back. Nothing ever will. What it did was draw a line so clear it couldn't be crossed again without consequence. It reminded everyone watching that authority has a source, and when you step outside it, you don't get to hide behind titles or clipboards. I leaned back and closed my eyes, feeling the evening breeze move across my face. For the first time since the night everything broke, my chest didn't feel like it was collapsing inward. It felt steady, Grief doesn't end. It changes shape. Responsibility doesn't end either. It just finds a new place to sit. When I stood to leave, I rested my hand on the bench one last time, not as a goodbye, as a promise. This place would stay what it was meant to be, a place to rest, a place to trust. As I walked back toward the car, I passed a couple pushing a stroller along the loop. They smiled at me without knowing why. The wheels rolled smoothly over the pavement. No one told them to move. That was the point. If you've ever faced down an unjust HOA, drop a comment telling me what happened and where you're watching from.